Well, hey, what's up, everybody? Thanks for checking into the channel. Matthew here. Glad to have you with us today. We're going to talk to Ben Zeisloft. Ben is the author of a new book, Forsakers of the Fatherless, and we're going to get into that, I'm sure, to some extent this morning. But Ben, how are you doing today, brother?
I'm doing well, brother. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It's raining over here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We were hoping for better weather today because we have a church event. What's it look like over there in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, here in Philadelphia, it's also pretty overcast and rainy. I know that's state of play usually for Pittsburgh, but not so much out here. So it looks like we're getting the same treatment out here today.
Yeah, usually you guys get the same weather that we get, but maybe 5, 6, 7 hours later than we do. So if we have a storm blowing through, it's definitely going to come down your way as well.
Right, for sure. Yeah. In my experience living in both places, I think I've read that Pittsburgh is one of the rainiest cities in the country, and I've sort of seen why that's the case now. It's like, wow, it's actually sunny today. That I have that reaction a lot more often out here.
Yeah, well, I'm from Northeast Ohio, so we're pretty used to cloud cover. In fact, where I'm from, we get some of the most number of cloud covered days in anywhere in the nation, and I think that's pretty similarly true for Western Pennsylvania. But whether or not withstanding, Ben, you're pretty excited right now because your book, Forsakers of the Fatherless, is coming out in August. Is that right?
That's that's right. Yes.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the main concept here. We're going to dive into this topic, and we'll just let the viewer know that this is going to be kind of a mature subject matter. We're going to be talking about abortion quite a bit today, and what believers can do to countervail that evil in our land. And Ben has written a book to that effect. So tell me about the main thrust of the book, and what were the ends that you were trying to accomplish in writing this book?
Absolutely. So the full title of the book is Forsakers of the Fatherless, the Secret Treachery of the Pro-Life Establishment. And the reason it's called that is because there is a lot of secret treachery in the pro-life establishment. So across the country, we've seen efforts to fully end abortion, establish equal protection of the laws for preborn babies. So basically apply the exact same homicide and assault laws that protect you and me, our lives as born people, to preborn people in the womb as well. And one of the greatest opponents to that, surprisingly, has been pro-life establishment lobbyists, lawmakers. So, the pattern of the book, and there's 8 chapters covering 8 different states, and most of them are actually red states. There's a couple of swing states mixed in, like Arizona, North Carolina, but most of these are deep red states: Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, states like that. It's actually the established pro-life leaders who say this is too far. We're doing political calculations behind the scenes, and this is too fast. And those are the sort of reasons that get brought up for why abortion can't be fully abolished, right here and now. So I think believers should know that. I think they should be aware that if they see a group with a pro-life label, it may or may not be a good one, and they should just be cautious to not prop up people who are actually working against our main goal, which is to fully end abortion and protect preborn babies.
Hmm. Yeah, so is this a deeply personal issue for you? I see that on Twitter and on your various social medias, and including this book here that's just come out. This seems to be one of the main preoccupations of your mind and your ministry. When did abortion abolition become a main thrust for you as far as how you're setting your life apart to the Lord to be used?
Absolutely. So, like most people, I grew up pro-life. I knew that abortion was wrong. My parents are believers. I grew up in evangelical church, so I always knew that I was pro-life. I knew that abortion was to be opposed by Christians. But it wasn't really until college where I got converted in my freshman year, and then those same friends who sort of brought me to the Lord took me to an abortion mill for the first time here in Philadelphia. So they were active in abortion mill ministry. They would go and give out gospel tracts and try to talk to women, hand out information for our local pregnancy center that our church supports. And that was pretty stunning to me because it was the first time that issue got flesh and bones for me, because I saw men and women going into the abortion clinic and then coming back out having murdered their children, and watching the women just weeping, and just all the iniquity, all the evil that goes on in a place like that, and just the lack of gospel light. So that was moving to me. I've spent the past 6 or 7 years doing that on weekends, mostly going down to the abortion mills in Philadelphia and trying to minister. And in terms of abolition, so I had some other good friends who were working at a group called Free the States, which is now Abolitionists Rising, who sort of challenged me on, what does the Bible actually say? Let's go back to first principles as Christians. What does the Bible say about how we deal with national sin or repentance, how we deal with unjust laws? And I think abolitionism gives a good system for that, where we don't show partiality in our laws. We don't regard faces, which is the meaning of that word in Hebrew. We don't say, let's save these lives, but not others. That would be an unjust, iniquitous decree. I think God explicitly condemns that in multiple points in his word. So that's where I guess the political element came in because, just being on the sidewalks outside of an abortion mill, you think, how is this going to actually end? It's the civil magistrate's job to do that. It's not our job as Christians merely to, set up crisis pregnancy centers and do gospel evangelism and all that's great. But really, it's the job of the civil magistrate to wield the sword to deter evil, to restrain bad behavior, to protect innocent life. So really, that's what led me into this angle of the fight is making sure that legislation is passing and trying to advance that legislation to actually treat babies in the womb just like people outside the womb.
Yeah, that's powerful. You mentioned Philadelphia, and some viewers might remember a connection between another very notorious murder case, and that would be the case of Kermit Gosnell. Are you aware of his abortion practices in Philadelphia?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, so that pregnancy center that I mentioned that my church helps to support, it's actually right next door to his old clinic. So if you walk past it, you can look into the building. It's currently abandoned. Last time I was there, probably several months ago. You can look into it. It's completely abandoned. There's trash everywhere. It's pretty spooky. I know that our crisis pregnancy center has been trying to actually get access to that building and actually buy that building and redeem it a little bit.
Yeah, that would be an amazing turn of fortune, so to speak, if the very place where Kermit Gosnell wrought his terrible, tragic wickedness could end up being converted and used for some better way to the glory of God. That'd make a really neat story, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, were you aware of his practice at all during the time, or did the chronology not line up there? Because I know his case came into light some several years ago now. Matter of fact, there was a really good podcast that came out. It was like a seven-part series that kind of exposed all the depths and depravity of his particular practice. I can't think of the name of the podcast right now. It's something kind of basic like uh, I can't think of it right now. But had you heard that podcast at all or no?
I had not. No.
Oh yeah, it's a really well produced podcast. It takes the listener all the way through the story of his rise to prominence and so forth, and then the heinous corruptions that he was doing, and then how he got found out and how he was eventually convicted and so forth. It's a really neat podcast. If I can think of the name of that, I'll try to post it in the description of this video. Well, if you're just tuning in, we're talking to Ben Zeisloft today. He is the author of a new book, Forsakers of the Fatherless, that's coming out by Founders Ministries in August, and it's for sale, for pre-sale right now. We should mention too, Ben, that there's a discount code that we'll post in the description of this video where you can get some 10% off. Well, take me into the process of writing the book. Have you ever written a book before, and how did you decide that this was going to be the topic that you were going to go after?
This is my first one. So until recently, I was a journalist where I was writing for the Daily Wire, and then after that, another news outlet called the Republic Sentinel, which is owned and operated by Christians. So having been working in the journalism world, conservative journalism space for the past few years, my mind has been sort of trained to look for underreported stories, and this is definitely one. There's this sort of organic movement of Christians across the country who are trying to, end abortion in their states completely. So what I did, each chapter is structured like it gets into legislation, it gets into those sorts of details, and which lawmakers were opposing them, which groups were opposing or supporting them. But also gets into the individual stories of Christians who are just trying to do the right thing, to love their people and neighbors as themselves, and sort of combines that like personal element into the political to show that really it's this movement of Christians doing the right thing before their Lord. They get converted. They for one reason or another, just like me, just sort of got aware of the abortion issue and then did everything they could to try to end it in their states, and then they get opposed by these pro-life establishment interests. So that's sort of the structure of the book. So in terms of the actual work going into it, it's a lot of I did a lot of interviews. There's a couple interviews per chapter, and each chapter is built around one main character who's sort of a statewide leader in ending abortion. And I also did some interviews with some of these pro-life leaders who are opposing them. So I got a couple of them on a record and did some phone interviews, some email exchanges with them, and made sure that folks are aware of their positions.
So it kind of comes off as like a journalistic book where you're basically trying to interview people, and obviously some that we would call abolitionists on one side, and then some others that you would call establishment pro-lifers on the other side, who are in some ways kind of the antagonists, I suppose, in this book, as you're setting up sort of a dichotomy, a tension between two different camps. On the one hand, we have your abortion abolitionists, and on the other hand, you have your what you're calling establishment pro-lifers. Now, let's talk about the verbiage here because in my church here, Gospel Fellowship PCA, we have for a long time been using the phraseology of pro-life to describe our church and our positions. We think abortion is evil and wrong. We think that life is good and created in the image of God. But now the word pro-life, is it taking on a different meaning?
I think so. There's some abolitionists who would also still use the term pro-life. I don't necessarily do that, but I don't fault those who do. I understand why. I mean, pro-life in itself isn't bad. As Christians, we're pro-life. We support human life made in God's image from conception to natural death. So, the term pro-life is not, inherently evil. I think what's happened is it's become tainted by a lot of these groups, leading groups that are calling themselves pro-life and yet doing anti-life things. So I think that's sort of where the debate arises around verbiage. So I don't, I call myself an abolitionist, but I have other friends who support abolitionist principles and call themselves pro-life, and I don't really fault them for it.
Yeah, it's hard as a pastor to kind of shift that because if I stood up in the pulpit one day and I said, "Hey, our church, we used to be pro-life, now we're not pro-life," I think people would assume the worst of that verbiage change and they would assume that we meant we actually are reverting to like a pro-abortion position, whereas
Right.
abolition is actually kind of a stricter form of pro-life. Would you say that that's true?
I'd say so, yeah. So it's trying to it depends on who you ask. It's either a separatist movement or a reform movement. So trying to reform the pro-life establishment and say, hey, we've gone off base. We need to go back to first principles here. Or other abolition groups, like probably more the one I'm a part of, the Foundation to Abolish Abortion, where I work as communications director. We're trying to build a new institution around the principles of abolition. So it sort of depends on who you ask. I think both are worthy endeavors. But that's sort of the mindset you'll find in the abolition world is either reform or, be a separatist or be a Puritan, basically.
Yeah, okay. So let's begin to try to break down some of the distinctions. So maybe for the viewer who's like, I'm confused here, what's the difference between abolition and pro-life? Don't both positions defend the notion of the imago Dei, the image of God? Don't both positions defend the idea of life from conception to natural death? And wouldn't both be opposed to abortion. But there are some distinctions in terms, maybe not so much of the theology as much as the mechanisms for trying to end abortion. So let's, Ben, if you can, let's lay out some comparisons here. If we were going to make a chart, sometimes I try to visualize information in my mind like a chart. So on one side, the abolitionist movement stands for this, and on the other side, the pro-life movement stands for that. Can you parse out some of the distinctions and maybe even some of the overlap between them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think both pro-life and abolition, they would both say that, it's going to be really hard to find like a pro-life person, even somebody who's in the pro-life establishment who says, babies are not human from conception, some other standard of when life begins. They become human at 3 months. I'm not aware of any pro-lifers who say that. So I think the distinction is, abolitionists would challenge that and say, well, if we are saying that all human beings are human from conception, made in God's image from conception, worthy of protection from conception, let's actually act like it in our laws. So it's the main methodological difference is between, do we abolish all abortion or do we regulate abortion? So in my book, I talk a lot about a lot of pro-life laws, and most of them, pretty much all of them, try to regulate some aspect of abortion. So you have heartbeat bills, which say, you can kill babies before they have a heartbeat, but just not after. Or you have, bills that say just widen the hallways at abortion clinics or have them have hospital admitting privileges, and then you're good to go. So it ranges from, let's save some babies to let's legally harass, abortion businesses or abortion clinics until they're forced to close. Um, and I think we should look at that in the light of God's law and say, what does God ask us to do? And I would contend that God asks us not to show partiality, to protect the fatherless, to protect all human beings with the same laws. So I think there's actually been a lot of bad fruit as well from that regulation mindsets of, abortion's been going just as strong for the past 50 years. There's been ups and downs, but right now we're actually, even after the overturn of Roe, we're on an uptrend. We're back to over 1 million abortions per year. And I would submit that it's because the church hasn't been calling for full abolition. We've been calling for mere regulation and sort of being satisfied with that. So that's the main methodological difference. And I think it depends on which pro-life group, of course, but I think a lot of the bigger pro-life groups would call themselves non-sectarian. They would say, religion's great. Most of us are religious, but we kind of leave that out of this fight. Whereas abolitionists would say, no, this is a gospel-driven movement. We need to be preaching repentance and faith, both to those who have taken part in abortion, so they can be forgiven. I know so many abolitionists who moms and dads who murdered their babies and came to the Lord later in life. Or it really just looking through the lens of God's law and saying, let's as Christians, how do we end abortion as Christians, not merely as people who agree with the science and philosophy of when life begins, but as explicitly Christians, how do we go about this? So I think those are some of the main differences. I hope that's helpful.
Now, there's a term that is sometimes used when we're discussing these matters of incrementalism, and that's the idea that basically, you start with a moral bad and you try to cut it back a bit at a time by perhaps making abortion harder and harder to obtain or making the restrictions just a little bit tighter at a time. But it sounds like abolitionism is not in favor of an incrementalist approach. Can you describe what that term means to you, and how would abolitionism be different from incrementalism?
Right. So I think the distinction between abolitionism and incrementalism is really, do we change things by degrees? So I would say that a good definition for incrementalism is the advocacy of change by degrees. Now, there's a sense in which, because we're finite people, we're human beings, we're bound by space and time. So everything we do is changed by degrees. If I were to walk across this room and get a cup of coffee, that would be a change by degrees. I can't just immediately teleport myself to the coffee machine. Um, I can't abolish abortion in every single state. I have to go from Texas to Oklahoma to Pennsylvania to Florida. You can't, so I think sometimes that gets conflated with what we would call mediatism. Like, you have to change everything at once. But then where's the limiting principle of that? Do you have to abolish all public evils in one bill with one foul swoop? So I think maybe a helpful way of thinking about incrementalism is regulationism is another helpful term. So
Okay.
do we end things by regulating it to death, or do we end it by going for the jugular, going for the root of the issue? And I would say it's definitely the latter. So even in our personal lives, if somebody is committing adultery or watching pornography or embezzling funds from his business, you don't start by taking less money out of the business, or by decreasing the number of times you meet up with your lover from twice a month to once a month. You do what Jesus said: cut off your right hand, gouge out your right eye. Pursue immediate repentance. Doesn't mean that you'll always get instant repentance. That's not how the Christian life really works. But when you find yourself in sin, we endeavor as best we can to repent of it all at once. So I'd say apply that individual sin to national sin, and say, if our nation is committing a national sin like child sacrifice, we call for immediate repentance. We don't call for, in 10 years, maybe we'll get the chance, or when the Supreme Court overturns Roe, then we might get the chance. We call for it immediately and without exception or compromise.
Yeah. Well, let me give you just a little bit of friendly pushback on that principle, though I largely agree with you. What if there was a law that said, in a particular state, let's take Pennsylvania, and it was going to restrict abortion from, I'm just making up numbers here, from the 30th week, it's permissible, to the 15th week. And so that cuts it back. And ostensibly, then you would be eliminating a certain number, tens of thousands of abortions by doing that. Would that be an example of regulationism, or would that be something that abolitionism would come in favor of?
I would say so. It would be regulationism, because if the reality is, politically, if you have the votes to do something like that, you probably also have the votes to actually end abortion. So I think also people underestimate how really those regulations end up shifting behavior. So really that law teaches is it's acceptable to kill a baby, not before 30 weeks, but now before 15 weeks. So now it just shifts the behavior. So actually, a friend of ours at the Foundation to Abolish Abortion, her name is Jenna Cross. She is a pregnancy center director up in Wisconsin. She actually has this interesting anecdote of when her state's heartbeat bill passed. What they saw was women were just more rushed to have abortions. So less people were coming to their pregnancy centers there. And when they did come, they were very frantic about their decision. They just said, all right, give me what I need to know. And then I need to go to my appointment later today, because there's a very limited window in which they could actually have the abortion. So I'm sure some of those laws save some lives, but I think we actually overestimate how helpful it is. With a law like that, I think there's another example of Lindsey Graham last year proposed a 15-week ban at the federal level. But the fact is, most abortions already happen really early in pregnancy. So I believe it's 94% of abortions happen before like the 15-week mark. So you're not, maybe saving as many babies as you think you are, even though it's well intentioned to want to save some babies or say, I think it's reasonable politically to limit it to a certain extent and find a compromise. But I think what Christians by and large need to be doing is preaching to the culture. Here's the standard. And then so the forward to my book is written by Senator Dusty Dverse from Oklahoma, and he gives a really helpful piece of advice, which is let them make the increments. So you go and you call for immediate abolition. And if other people respond to that by saying, okay, there's some pressure in my state now building to abolish abortion, we need to give them something, they might come up with some increment. They might come up with a heartbeat bill or a 15-week ban or something like that. Let that be on their hands. Let them do that, and then come back the next year calling for the exact same thing, which is abolition. And so at the same time, in a lot of these states where abolition movements have been thriving, you see these increasingly aggressive pro-life laws, and really some lawmakers going in that direction without going all the way because they feel that pressure. So that would be my reaction to that. Yes.
Okay. So, the viewer might notice a connection with the phraseology of abolition to the concept of slavery. And often when we think of abolition, for instance, if we were to just go out on the streets and say, hey, we're advocating for the cause of total abolition today, some people might think that we're actually talking about racial matters or slavery. Was that term selected because of its connection to historical matters related to slavery, a position which I would imagine almost every American is against slavery? Is there some sense in which there's an intentional analogous connection here between abolishing abortion and abolishing slavery, which we did in the past? What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first chapter of my book is an interview with a guy named Russell Hunter from Oklahoma. So he has an interesting story in terms of how he came to care about the abortion issue, where he was a believer, kind of a squishy pro-lifer, and he was studying for a history of science degree at the University of Oklahoma, I believe. But he was studying Darwin and the slavery abolitionists, basically, in some of those 19th century issues. And then at the same time, he was asked to participate in a debate where he was defending the pro-life position. But in his studies at university, he was seeing, okay, so it's the same sort of reality with slavery, where there's these anti-slavery gradualists who are fine with kind of restricting slavery, like on slave ships, passing bills that say don't put 400 slaves on the ship, put 300 to 200, so sort of regulating the circumstances around slavery and the slave trade. So when he came to do that debate, he didn't actually defend the pro-life position. Instead, he advocated for how the pro-life movement needs to be changed and reformed, and how Christians should stand against some of those sort of compromising principles, I suppose. A lot of abolitionists will cite people like William Wilberforce, where he was a lawmaker in Britain, a member of Parliament, and for 2 decades he sort of had the same exact slave trade abolition bill that he would bring every single session. And at the first session, he saw maybe one or two supporters, but then within 20 years, they abolished the slave trade and they completely changed the culture as well against the slave trade. So, and I believe he found out on his deathbed as well that it happened, which is pretty cool in God's providence. But that's sort of the mindset. So there is a direct connection to slavery abolition, is saying, when there's a public national evil, public sin, we sin against as Christians, calling for full and complete repentance.
I think that does make sense as an analogy because most people would understand, by way of example, that if you were talking about slavery and you said, well, we're against slavery, but what we're going to do is we're going to roll it back to we're going to prevent anybody who's taller than 5'8" from being a slave, but we're going to permit people that are 5'7" or less to continue to be slaves under the argument that it would be reducing slavery by a significant degree to just sort of cut back the percentage of who is applicable for, the institution of slavery. People would immediately throw up their hands and say, well, that's ridiculous. That's
Right.
absurd on its face because slavery is either right or it's wrong. If we're going to abolish slavery, we ought to abolish the entirety of slavery, not just those that are, 5'8" and taller. So I think some people could probably make a connection with that if we're talking about a moral evil, then it's evil all the way through, and it can't be justified in the median. So maybe that might be something that viewers might think about for the first time. Well, let's talk about some of what you described as the restrictionist position, or what we sometimes call slippery, or I think you said squishy pro-life. How has that as a movement actually shot itself in the foot at times? Maybe even people with good intentions to restrict or reduce or completely abolish abortion, yet nevertheless, the pro-life movement and kind of getting weak in moments of crisis has ended up leading to moral compromise. Can you think of any examples in your book where you detail something like that?
Yeah, there's a good number of examples like that. I think one of the best ones is actually what we're living through right now after the overturn of Roe. So, June 24th, 2022, the Supreme Court says Roe v. Wade is overturned. Now we have Dobbs basically kicking the can back to the states and saying, you just decide what to do with abortion. So, of course, a lot of the red states, a lot of the ones that I cover in my book, had trigger laws that shut down all the abortion clinics and charged abortionists with crimes if they went through with an abortion. Usually not murder, usually some lesser, maybe like a large fine or penalty, maybe a year or two in prison, but usually not, equal protection. Not saying that, these are babies that you're killing, just saying here's this practice that should be discouraged. But what we've seen in the process over the past 3 years is some of those states where they had the most pro-life bills, most pro-life compromises. They've actually seen the greatest increases in abortion in the entire country. So states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama are some of they're seeing the greatest influxes of abortion pills into their states. Um, so that's a significant issue we're dealing with now, and it's because the laws they passed didn't just establish equal protection; they regulated abortion specifically for abortion providers and not for women who willfully order abortion pills, take abortions. So the laws that we advocate for would just say, no matter who you are, male, woman, third party, a parent of that child, just like it is if you kill an infant or a 3-year-old, if you kill somebody, you face penalties for murder or homicide, whatever it is in that state. So a lot of these pro-life groups sort of shot themselves in the foot by saying that women should be blanketly exempt from these charges. So there's a lot of pro-life laws that I detail in the book that actually have explicit provisions saying that women can never be charged for an abortion. It literally says that in the law itself. And I would say there's this mindset of women are second victims of abortion. I would say I think some women are definitely victims of abortion. I think it's quite possible. I've seen it a few times on the sidewalks of women being heavily pressured or even forced into going through with an abortion. But I would say in the case of the woman who willfully does it, who knows it's a baby, and that can be proven in a court of law, I think she should face charges like everybody else. And because the pro-life movement hasn't really been willing to take that stand, we've sort of seen this flourishing of self-managed abortion, self-induced abortion, abortion pills, where there's actually more abortion happening in some of the reddest, most conservative states in the country because of that reality.
Hmm. Yeah, well, again, we're talking about the book Forsakers of the Fatherless by Ben Zeisloft, my guest here today. You got Dusty Dverse to do the foreword for the book. That's a pretty good get. How did you get Dusty involved in this?
Yeah, I've known Dusty for several years. He's been active in the abolition movement, I think, since 2018 or 2019. So he's in addition to a state senator, he's a local church pastor, Baptist pastor, Reformed Baptist pastor in Oklahoma. So he's been at the forefront of abolition issues for a long time, and he finally, sort of had a chance providentially to run for an office. And he has a cool story as well of defeating some of the pro-life establishment types in his state in order to run this David and Goliath campaign and get into office. And now he's sort of this national figurehead for what a Christian can do with a civil office for righteousness. So he's been a friend for a few years now. So I was happy that he wrote the foreword for my book. Yes.
Yeah, he seems to be something of a model for what a Christian statesman could look like. Wish there were more Dusty Devers out there. Have you got to meet him in person, or most of your correspondence has been online, or how does that work?
Mostly online. I did meet him in person last year at the Southern Baptist Convention when I was there reporting on it. But I've known him for several years, just through channels like this, right? Video chats, texting, things like that.
Yeah. So he's a Southern Baptist, huh?
Yes,
Well, I guess we Presbyterians could forgive him for that.
that's right.
Okay. Sorry about that. One of the first times I think you came across my radar, Ben, was when you went on the Tim Pool show, which again is a pretty good get. That's a show online. Tim Pool does an amazing amount of videos. I think that's all he does is just record YouTube videos and Rumble videos and so forth. But he gets tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of viewers on his content. And he had you as a guest on his show. Tell me about how you got that big gig and how it went.
Yeah, so his editor-in-chief at the time was aware of abolitionism and wanted to platform an abolitionist. So she had asked me, what are some good examples of abolitionists I could have on. So I think I mentioned Dusty, I mentioned Jeff Durbin, I mentioned my boss, Bradley Pierce, the president of the Foundation to Abolish Abortion. And she actually said, no, we want you on. So I ended up having the opportunity to head down to West Virginia to their studio and be involved in that. And the episode I was on was the day after the vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. So there wasn't as much of an opportunity to talk about the abortion issue specifically. I think I mentioned that abortion is child sacrifice, and there's an interesting exchange I had with one of the co-hosts who wanted to know about that. So I was explaining from a Christian perspective what it looks like for, even something like abortion to be child sacrifice because you're exchanging the life of your child for convenience or prosperity. I think James Lindsay interestingly got mad at it for some reason, and he kind of blew it up on X, which didn't necessarily intend. But that was a great opportunity. I had a few moments where I got to shine a light for the gospel and talk about this issue, which I'm definitely thankful for.
Yeah. Did you get a chance to interact with Tim Pool himself, or were you just kind of whisked into his compound place with all the skate parks he has and so forth? Did you get a chance to like hang out with the guy?
A little bit, yeah. So it was mostly just before and after the show, just small talk basically. And he was telling me about some of the business endeavors they're doing and some of their partners, which was pretty interesting. But yeah, definitely thankful for But most of that exchange was during the actual episode.
Yeah. Now, he doesn't strike me as a believer at all. Is he a Christian?
I don't believe so. Yeah, he sort of got uncomfortable a couple times when I'd start to critique some things that the Trump administration was, or I guess still the Trump campaign was promoting. So things like amending the RNC platform to basically remove any distinctive language about life or even about marriage. I think I criticized that a little bit. He wasn't too thrilled about that. I could see across the table that he maybe got a little bit uneasy. But yeah, he doesn't strike me as a believer necessarily.
Yeah, he might have been a little bit uneasy there, but probably the tension within the conversations kind of drives the excitement of the show. I mean, obviously he
Right.
has people that he agrees with come on the show to talk with him, but also people that he disagrees with too. Any intense exchanges there besides that one, or how else did the conversation flow?
Not at all. No, it was very amicable for the most part, and yeah, I can't remember. I don't think he got mad at me or anything like that. I think he, just disagreed, which is, it is what it is. But it went well overall for sure.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, you mentioned Jeff Durbin too, and his good work over at Apologia, and what's their ministry called? Abolish Abortion Now, I think that's right.
Yeah, and abortion now. Yeah.
End Abortion Now. Yeah.
Mhm.
Have you got a chance to meet Jeff at all?
Yeah, I've met him several times. Yeah, various events. I met him at G3 2 years ago. A few abolition events across the country where we were lobbying for bills. He was actually in Pennsylvania in 2021 when we had an abolition bill, and he was speaking at a rally for that. So I've met him a handful of times. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, I wanted to ask you about a couple other things that are, as a really practical matter before we wind down, Ben. Can we talk a little bit about two kinds of ministry here? And let's go with street ministry first. And then I want to talk to you about the broader role of the local church and how the local church can get involved. You mentioned being on the streets and sometimes doing some witnessing and perhaps some social engagement of various kinds. What does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, so for me, it's for us in Philadelphia, it's mostly just going to the abortion mills and preaching the gospel. So we actually even don't usually use a microphone or anything like that. We just because of the Planned Parenthood we're at in Philadelphia, it's very close quarters. They have to walk right by us to get into the building. So usually we're just able to speak directly to them and say, hey, I'm a Christian. Can I offer you some help and support? We'd love to help you if you're pregnant this morning. And then it's an interesting I guess, skill to learn to discern when somebody's, sort of set in having an abortion and maybe a little bit more willing to talk and adjusting your approach accordingly. So like Ray Comfort and his constant advice on his channel, he's a prominent evangelist. He says, "Law to the proud and grace to the humble." So when they cut, maybe there's women who flip us the bird or start cursing at us, then it gets into more like, "Man, please do not murder your child. Like, please repent, come talk to us. We want to help you." But if somebody's willing to talk, then we can talk about their life story and the issues that are driving them to consider abortion. So that's been an interesting thing to learn, and definitely sanctifying and learn to mortify your flesh and appreciate God's justice even for when you see the abortion abortionists go in every single day, and he nothing happens to him. He kills 20, 30 babies in there, and then he continues on with his life. So sort of trusting, like in a Psalm 37 sense, that God is going to deal with evildoers in his way and his time. So I've learned a lot through that ministry for sure. That's sort of what it looks like. I hope that's helpful.
How often do you guys go on the streets to do this kind of active witnessing?
For me, it's most Saturdays these days. When I was in college and I had some afternoon classes, I would, go more in the week on the weekdays in the mornings. We have another guy who goes on Tuesdays here in Philadelphia, so we have some distribution across the week, but most of us go on Saturdays, which is one of their kill days.
Yeah.
So
What do you guys do to prepare for that? How do you get your group ready to go? What kinds of things do you talk about before you go on the street, and how do you debrief how it went after?
yeah, so this at this point, most of us have been doing it for a few years. So we sort of have this rhythm going where we'll have a few of us outside the actual, the front doors of the abortion mill. We have a couple others who are just doing handing out gospel tracts or something like that on the street, maybe holding a sign and engaging conversations. But in terms of, yeah, we'll do the occasional prayer meeting, and we'll get together and set apart some time for prayer just for our ministry. And we'll pray for the abortion clinic death escorts who, sort of are volunteers who stand guard outside the abortion mill and kind of whisk women in there. We'll pray for the staff, things like that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, our church does this too. We don't do it every single weekend, but we do have a committee that sort of organizes our forays out to the abortion clinics in our area here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm very proud of that group. Our committee was recently established here at Gospel Fellowship, and we have some really ardent people who love the Lord and are zealous for the cause, and I'm just very thankful for that. My own wife has worked in ministries related to life and care for a number of years now, and I'm just very proud of her work. And they just recently went down to the abortion clinic. I guess it was last weekend. So we go maybe several times a year, maybe a little bit more than quarterly, probably, but not every single weekend. Although we do have a couple of people that do. They go quite often just on their own or with other groups that are interested in the abolition of abortion. So we're thankful for that. You probably even know a couple of the people in our church. I think they know you, which is cool. I won't necessarily say their names here, but we're thankful for that. What would you say to churches in general? Many viewers of my particular YouTube channel and this podcast are pastors or elders or active participants in their local churches. What would you say to a church that wants to move towards a little bit more of a vigorous kind of abolition ethos rather than what you called a squishy pro-lifeism previously? How do you work that maturity in your congregation?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I'm thankful that you mentioned the crisis pregnancy centers. I want to give the impression that being on the sidewalks, being at the abortion mill is the only faithful way to serve. So like my own wife, she's been to the sidewalk with me, but she also volunteers for our pregnancy center, just doing some basic volunteer work, administrative stuff. So I don't want to give the impression that the only way to be a faithful Christian is you have to be outside the abortion mill every single weekend. There's other ways to do it for sure. But in terms of the church, how to engage the church. I used to be in the mindset of, it's all the pastor's fault that, there's not an active abolition ministry at every single church in America. Basically call the pastor. He has to be the one who's on the sidewalk every weekend. I don't really think that anymore. I think that, having some better theology is, the pastors they oversee word and sacrament. They're very busy people. They're ministering, they're visiting folks in the congregation. But I think something like what your church does, where you have a few people set apart to sort of do that work, and the pastor is explicitly supporting that work is a really, really good step. So not every church is willing to do that, unfortunately. There's some churches and who would say, there's women in our congregation who had abortions, so we can't really talk about it. Or they'll come up with some other kind of pragmatic excuse for why it's controversial, why it's too edgy. But really, this is what Christians have been doing for the past 2,000 years. It's always been, Christians every time they go into a new culture, child sacrifice, infanticide, abortion, all those sorts of things get overturned because that's an outworking of the gospel. If we love life and we recognize that God is the author of life, He gave us eternal life. That leads us to love our neighbors in that same kind of way, to stand, Proverbs 24, rescue those being taken away to death, hold back those stumbling to the slaughter. So I think this should be viewed as a bread and butter activity for American Christians as well. it hasn't been for the past 50 years. I think, unfortunately, Roe v. Wade has sort of coincided with the pragmatic movement. And I know that you talk about that a lot with your book, Worship Tainment, and things like that. Of sort of seeing the church as this pragmatic means to win unbelievers, and therefore you can't talk about controversial things like abortion, like so-called same-sex marriage, and things like that. But I think we're sort of coming out of that mindset a little bit, hopefully, and seeing some more willingness to engage and fight evil in the world, because we're realizing it bore really bad fruit to adopt that, the church as mere evangelism rather than a place for believers to circle the wagons and worship and be edified, and then go out back into the world and do good things for God's glory. So I think those are some of the realities there. I don't think every pastor needs to be, a full-time political activist or sidewalk counselor, but I think a good first step is just encouraging those in his church who have those inclinations. I know that my elders do that with me all the time. They encourage the folks in our church who are on the sidewalks, and other pastors should do the same for sure.
Yeah, not every pastor is necessarily going to be as gifted or as talented as like a Jeff Durbin or a Dusty Dverse, and certainly not are going to have the time or the wherewithal to be able to fully invest themselves in that kind of a ministry like they have, or run for political office or so forth. I think it takes extraordinary men to kind of to do those certain things. But in my evangelism class at the seminary, I teach at RPTS, Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary. By the way, good place to go to school if you're interested, anyone out there. But in the evangelism class, one of the things that I say is that every church should have some kind of outward focused evangelistic ministry, either something related to abortion, or perhaps caring for the poor, or perhaps trying to find ways to reach prisoners or so forth. Some of these ministries that the scripture seems to identify, widows and orphans, are an obvious one. But not every church is geographically oriented in a place that's close to an abortion clinic, for instance. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't be aware of what's happening in our nation today and some of the greater trends that are happening. One of the greatest trends, and I shouldn't say great because it's terrible, but one of the more profound trends, I might say, is moving from what you might call your clinical style abortion to abortion by way of medication. In other words, the abortifacient medicines are so ubiquitous now and so easy to obtain that a lot of women are choosing to get their abortions just by way of mail order drugs rather than having to shamefully go into the abortion clinic and obtain an abortion that way. What does the abolition movement say? How does it respond to the proliferation of abortifacient medicines now that just simply you take a dose or two, kill your child, and it's very secret and practically unknown to most people? How do we respond?
Yeah, that's definitely the tragic part of the abortion pills, is that feasibly a woman in her dorm room or just at home could order them and take them, and then only she and God knows about it, basically. So that's why I would say that equal protection is such an important fight right now, is saying that, no matter who you are, we just treat you with the same legal standard, and say that murdering anyone should be illegal for everyone. That's a phrase we use a lot at the Foundation to Abolish Abortion. That's why, that particular fight is so important, is because oftentimes, unfortunately, it is the women themselves who are ordering it and choosing to do that. And I would just say that they're following the regulation that these pro-life states have put in place. They're saying, anybody can kill a baby except for a woman. So now that's the course that things are going, because people are realizing, and abortion providers are realizing, as long as the woman herself does it, then nobody can charge her. Then we're good to go. And also, equal protection, I'd be remiss to forget mentioning, protects women from things like coercion, because in most states it's not illegal to pressure somebody into doing something that's legal for them. So it's not illegal for somebody to pressure someone into ordering a pizza. That's a completely legal activity. But it is illegal for somebody to ask somebody to commit murder. It's called soliciting murder.
Yeah.
So in a situation where, the husband wants to abort and the wife doesn't, and he orders the abortion pills and sort of forces them upon his wife, he can't be charged with a crime for doing that, because it's legal for her to do that. But under equal protection laws, they would treat that as murder, just like soliciting murder is a crime. If you put a knife in somebody's hand and say you need to stab that person, it would be a crime for putting abortion pills in somebody's hand and saying you need to abort that baby in your womb. So that's why this fight is so important. Obviously, because it's happening in secret. If a state were to pass an abolition bill, equal protection bill, it wouldn't be like abortion ends overnight, but legal abortion would end. If there were enough evidence in court to arise, maybe a girlfriend has an abortion that the boyfriend didn't want, so the boyfriend informs the civil magistrate, "Hey, my wife just killed our child. I need your help." Then and here's the evidence to prove it. Here's the text threads. Here's me talking to her and trying to convince her out of it, and she wouldn't budge. So those are the sorts of situations we would see, coming into the court. I think really the first thing that would happen is the abortionists themselves would be penalized. That's obviously the nexus of the issue. Those are the people who we need to go for first. But I think equal protection would provide for anybody who kills somebody can be charged for it. I think that's how we solve this self-managed abortion crisis.
Hmm. Well, you mentioned a few particular organizations, grassroots and so forth, and an alphabet soup of different collectives that people might want to be aware of. So the first you mentioned is the Foundation to Abolish Abortion. That's the one that you are a participant in. Did I get that right?
Correct. Yes.
And then there's also Abolition Rising. Is that a Pennsylvania thing or is that national?
That's nationwide, so they're based in Oklahoma. So they do a lot of cultural engagements. They have a very large YouTube channel, YouTube platform, TikTok. So if people have probably seen the videos, they're holding signs down the street. They're doing these, sort of quick conversations with folks about abortion.
And then there's Apologia Church and End Abortion Now. Any other groups or ministries that we want to shout out that people might consider getting involved in, depending on where they live?
Yeah, those are some of the really good national ones. I throw in Operation Save America as well. They do a lot of regional conferences, things like that. They'll try to send boots on the ground when there's like a political fight, doors that need to be knocked. Or I was with them last year in Florida for Amendment 4, trying to enshrine. They were trying to prevent the enshrinement of abortion into the state constitution. So I knocked doors with them, spoke at their conference. And then most states these days actually have a dedicated state level abolition group. So here in Pennsylvania, we have Abolish Abortion PA. So I was out in Pittsburgh your way a few weeks ago for one of their local conferences. So folks can definitely get involved on the ground with local abolitionists, and there's usually some kind of state level group they can find.
hmm That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for coming on with me today. Let's talk about your book real quick one more time. The title is Forsakers of the Fatherless, published by Founders Ministries. And the book is set to come out in August. Perhaps it'll be available on other outlets like Amazon a little bit later. But what you can do right now is pre-order the book, and there'll be a discount code in the description of this video. If you want to go pre-order it from Founders, that would be a great thing. Ben, any shout outs or final notes, anything you want to link to, or anything you want to push people towards to snoop around and check out more of your work anywhere?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd encourage folks to check out FAA.life. So that's our website, the Foundation to Abolish Abortion. We have a docu-series right now called Abortion Free. So it kind of really dives into the legal and cultural status we're at post Roe. So that's another really good resource for folks to watch. I think it's six, 20, 25-minute videos. Really well produced, really well done. So that's a great resource as well.
Is that for free? You can get that online?
That one's for free. Yes. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Well, you can also follow Ben on X and some of his other social media. So if you're interested in talking more to Ben or perhaps having him give you some information related to the abolition of abortion, I'm sure he'd be glad to reach out or reach back to you. Ben, thank you so much for coming on the channel today. As always, I love you all lots, and we'll talk to you later.